Well, good morning and welcome again. We're going to go ahead and get started. I know that people will continue to trickle in. But just as if you weren't here last Sunday, this is Kristen Mitchell, an old friend of mine. We've known each other for over 20 years. She was instrumental, actually, in me coming back to the Episcopal Church after I left my Presbyterian church. She was also the associate director at Servant Leadership School, where I worked. And now she has her MDiv from Union Theological Seminary, and she's a spiritual director, and there's a lot of adult formation around the diocese. And we were exploring last week this concept of sacred time and what that means to step into sacred time. And there's no way I can, it was a fantastic, but it took an hour to nutshell it. But one of the things we talked about is how do we begin to step off the hamster wheel of our busy cultural, phenomenon, especially around this time of year, and create space for what the heart of Advent really is, which is time for reflection and stillness, and opening our eyes to look for where the light is already on the move, and not just be stuck on autopilot. And one of the most powerful means of that, historically, is a monastic practice called praying the hours, which we're going to dive into today. And the invitation here, it's kind of a structure to the day that is designed to pop us out of autopilot and really back into the present moment. And what she's going to dive into today is how do we, who have chosen not to live a monastic life, we're not cloistered in a monastery, but we have full lives, how do we incorporate this ancient Christian practice into our lives in a meaningful way? So, thank you.
Hi. Do we have newcomers today who weren't here last week? Yeah, good. Okay. So, welcome back if you were here last week, but welcome to the newcomers. I'm going to try to review a little bit of what we talked about last week. So, hopefully, anybody who's here for the first time will begin to get a sense of this overarching theme of this class. This is a 3-session class on liturgical time. So we're looking at how our liturgical cycles, daily, weekly, and yearly, help us step into this sense of sacred time within our Christian faith tradition. And I want to start off today kind of where we left off last week, which was talking about the Sabbath. We were talking about the fourth commandment. And for anybody that was here last week, what do you remember about what we talked about in terms of what it means to honor the Sabbath, if anything? There you go. That's a really good way of putting it, actually. What we talked about, we sort of defined sacred time as being time that is set apart for rest, for resting in God. Because in our creation story, God made the Sabbath, which literally means the seventh day. So God made the seventh day sacred by resting on that day as a way of modeling for us, we who are made in the image of God, that we are also supposed to rest in the goodness of God's creation. We are not created to think that everything is up to us, or that we need to somehow be more hardworking than God. This is meant to humble us, but it's also meant to restore us to a kind of sanity by making room in our lives for the very things that we were created to enjoy. So the fourth commandment calls us to rest, but it doesn't require us to be perfectly still and quiet for 24 hours, right? It's resting from certain kinds of behaviors to make room for other kinds of behaviors, right? So does anybody remember, how would you characterize the kinds of things that we are meant to rest from?
Sharing time with others that we care about, walking.
Yes. Yes, that is what we are meant to rest for. How would you characterize the things that we're meant to rest from on the Sabbath?
Insanity.
I love that.
What did she say?
Insanity.
Insanity, yeah. So one way to put it is that we are encouraged to rest from earning kinds of behaviors, right? I used the example of a Jewish friend who chooses not to push the buttons on an elevator as part of his Shabbat practice, not because pushing a button is physically hard work, but because it's part of this quid pro quo way of being in the world, right? The sense of doing something in order to make something happen for us, of giving in order to get. These are the kinds of behaviors that we know we need to psychologically rest from on a periodic basis because they create in us an addictive mentality of anxiety and control. Oops. It's this looping, right? That's the insanity. The more we do these kinds of behaviors, the more we feel like we need to do them, right? The more we become dependent on that feeling, that belief that we have to do this in order to be in control of our lives, in order to be okay. And so that even though when it stops working, or if it's not working, we sort of think, well, we just need to do it more, right? We need to get more, we need to have more. And unfortunately, these kinds of behaviors are exactly what our entire economy is based on right now, right? This dopamine addiction cycle is exactly what everybody's kind of doing right now, this effort to figure out new technological ways to kind of amplify this cycle because it's good for sales, it's good for markets.
Kristen,
Yeah.
reminds me, I think it was a week before I started at St. Luke's, I was asked to speak at a conference for all these very successful CEOs, and I took them through, it wasn't called centering prayer because it was kind of a secular concept, but it was centering prayer. It was 5 minutes. And at the end, one guy, the first thing he said was, "That was awful." And I said, "Well, why is that?" He said, "I felt completely lazy and unproductive." And when I invited him to recognize the rest, that this would actually, if he chose to step off the hamster wheel, and this would actually empower him to be far more effective when he was working, I could just tell, it just went right over his head. But he equated 5 minutes of stillness with laziness. And I really
probably
think,
how much money he lost.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, right? I mean, but I think it's
well, and it's also very rampant this time of year, which is part of what we talked about last week, right? So I'm just curious, after this discussion that we had last week, did anybody notice any moments in your own life where you kind of recognized this sort of mentality operating every 15 minutes? Okay. So did anybody notice something that felt like a glimpse of resting from that? Like a momentary Sabbath that broke in to, yeah.
Because people for me love the excitement of being retired, which I've been retired for a number of years. But for me, retirement is that I don't have a Sabbath in the strictest sense of the word, but I just appreciate this stuff all the time, every day, off and on, and then pull out of it, pull out of the insanity as much as possible, screen addiction, whatever.
Yeah.
But retirement affords that for me, at least, that it's those spaces are there.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Apparently not.
I think what I would like for us to do, and what I would like to invite you to do for the rest of this season of Advent, is to just watch for that. Right? Advent is a season of not just waiting, but watching for those kind of moments of Sabbath breaking through. And so when we talk about the Sabbath, though,
Excuse me.
yeah.
Could you say what we're watching for?
Oh, I'm sorry. Watching for.
If somebody says something from the audience, I can't hear it.
Okay, gotcha. I'll try to repeat a little bit, maybe. So watching for those moments of signs of God already in our midst, but also signs of God breaking through in some new way. That's kind of what the season of Advent is about, but it's also what Sabbath is about. Finding those little moments of rest throughout the insanity of kind of the everyday, mundane pressures. But when we talk about the Sabbath, obviously over time in Christianity, we developed a really different understanding than our Jewish friends of the law of Moses in general, and particularly the fourth commandment. So somebody actually pointed this out last week. They said, well, in Christianity, we changed this, right? We've not only moved from Saturday to Sunday, but we kind of changed our whole idea of what it even means to honor the Sabbath. And a lot of that has to do with the gospel tradition itself. It has to do with Jesus' own ministry and his reinterpretation of some older ideas about the Sabbath. We mentioned last week that one of the things Jesus got into trouble for was that he did not live a monastic sort of religious life set apart from everyone, but he very much chose to live right in the fray of everyday life with its dinner parties and its holidays and its polarized political arguments, right? And right in the midst of that, Jesus is constantly calling his peers to consider the deeper intention of the Sabbath. And part of how he did that was by talking to people, but the main way he did that was by embodying it, right? He didn't just give people new teachings about the Sabbath. He lived a Sabbath way of life. And he didn't just do it alone, but he invited other people to walk alongside him. And in doing that, he was able to model for the disciples, but then also for us, through the stories that are passed down through the apostles, what it looks like to live the Sabbath contextually in everyday life, not just as a day set apart, but as a way. Those who followed in this way of Jesus sought to live their lives immersed in a Sabbath sensibility. It was quite different from just setting apart one day to do or not do certain kinds of behaviors. We know that Jesus did observe the Sabbath, right? He did observe all the old Hebrew religious holidays, so he wasn't like against that. But it highlighted an inherent danger that comes with any kind of religious practice. And that is that very often, instead of returning us to sanity, right? The word religion, I don't know if you've talked about this, means to reconnect. So instead of reconnecting us to God, our religious practices often become just another form of button pushing, right? Another way to give in order to get. So last week, I talked about this as the cosmic vending machine mentality, right? So I give a goat to Artemis, I get wind for my sailing trip. That was how it worked in the ancient world. That's the basic understanding of our relationship to the universe or to the gods. And it basically boils down to this. I put my prayers in, I get special blessings from the gods. And we still see this today, this very pagan religious logic, but we still see it in the prosperity gospel, certainly in Christianity, but also in secular culture. It's called the law of attraction nowadays, and there's many self-help books that you can get to tell you how to tap into this cosmic vending machine. So incidentally, this is actually part of how money was invented originally. Coins were originally little pieces of metal that were stamped with a family insignia that were created to be given as temple offerings, so that the god or the goddess would know who made that offering, so they would know who to bestow blessings on, right? That's how currency originally gained its value. It's also why Jesus, when asked what to do with these coins, like, what do I do with this coin that's stamped with Caesar's face? He says, give it back. It has no value. It has no inherent value in God's good creation. This is also a huge part of why Christians were so reviled in ancient Rome. They were actually, in the early days of the church, thought to be atheists because of their indifference towards the gods. Their unwillingness to make these sacrifices to them. The Romans were afraid that the gods were going to get really pissed off and retaliate with some kind of catastrophe. You actually see this in the question that Paul answers in the Corinthians, in his letter to the Corinthians about whether to eat meat that's been sacrificed to idols. He's like, it's fine. I mean, you can eat it, because it's like the gods are not real. They're just statues, so it's just meat. So you can eat it, it's fine, but don't eat it if it's going to confuse anybody, right? Like don't, if somebody thinks, they're new to the faith and they think you're going to get some special cosmic grace out of eating it, maybe refrain from that. So in other words, do what's helpful to your neighbor, not because you're going to get something out of it, but because that's the way of Christ. That's the Sabbath way, not the cosmic vending machine. So the idea is to move away from this cosmic vending machine altogether. And this starts to get really amplified, especially in the 2nd century. So as Christians begin to distinguish themselves from rabbinic Judaism, they start to talk about following the Sabbath, again, less as one day. Christians still continued to do the Sabbath as a religious practice for a couple hundred years, but they really wanted to live it every day. So Justin Martyr, you see this in a lot of the early Christian writings. Justin Martyr writes, the new law requires Christians to keep the Sabbath constantly. Irenaeus, who's a French bishop, writing around 180, says, the Christian is not commanded to leave idle one day of rest, who is constantly keeping the Sabbath. Tertullian, who is writing a little bit later in the 3rd century, says, we ought to observe a Sabbath from all servile work, always, not only on the 7th day, but through all time. So this is detecting the theme here. One of my favorite quotes along these lines is from St. Clement of Alexandria, who writes, now we are commanded to reverence and honor the Savior, not on special days as some others, but doing this continually in our whole life, in every way, holding festival then in our whole life, persuaded that God is altogether on every side present. We cultivate our fields praising. We sail the sea hymning. In other words, we can live and work and be in the world and carry this love and this knowledge of God with us as a Sabbath way of life. The irony, of course, is that for us, 2,000 years later, we now have a version of this that has emerged within Christianity where, much like the Jews in Jesus' time, Christians today have kind of lost the thread on the intention behind these kinds of teachings, and so they think it means we must eliminate all forms of embodied religious practice, right? That's what the Baptists call it, works, right? That any form of active or embodied kinds of ways of practicing our faith just becomes this cosmic vending machine. Here's the catch. Many of those people have their own version of the cosmic vending machine. It's just all up here, right? So it's purely cerebral. I have all the correct beliefs in my head about Jesus Christ, my Lord and Savior, and I get to heaven. So even thoughts, correct religious beliefs, can become a kind of works. Because the truth is, you can do this with literally anything. I know a lot of people, I'm sure you do, who do it with meditation, right? Or yoga. You put in a considerable number of hours in meditation, you get inner peace, or wellness, or enlightenment. You can do this with anything. There are versions of this in literally every religious culture all over the world and throughout history and in secular culture, because this is just kind of how humans are, right? This is one of the most common ways that we try to eliminate anxiety in our lives, by giving ourselves the illusion of control. But back to this. Ultimately, though, it creates more anxiety for us. Yeah?
I don't know whether we actually want to control when we have the, I should say, opportunity to trust God in all things, giving thanks in all things. It makes life so much easier.
That is absolutely correct. That is absolutely correct. That's why Jesus calls it a yoke. Jesus wants to remove that yoke and calls us back to this Sabbath way of life where we rest from this in all of its forms. And so this is actually exactly how the Christian tradition of contemplation developed. The technical definition of contemplation is not just like the idea of sitting quietly in prayer. It's defined as resting in God. So we have approaching prayer that moves us out of this older religious model of like making sacrifices to gods or trying to control the outcome of our lives through our relationship with the universe, and moves us more into this open field of awareness that allows people to rest in God wherever they are. Many people in retirement discover that. But also whatever they're doing, even if you're still at work, slogging away. We see this especially in the way that daily prayer practices developed in the early church. So before like even our weekly kind of pattern of weekly services got clearly developed, we had this tradition that emerged in the early church of daily prayer. And it differed quite considerably from the way that the Pharisees and later the rabbinic Jews developed their prayer practices. So for Pharisees, their goal was to replicate the Hebrew temple religion within the home or within the synagogue, right? They wanted to carry on this tradition. And so they developed a practice of praying 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening, facing in the direction of the temple. And those prayers connected back to the prayers that would have been happening in the temple during those times. So for Jews, the practice of daily prayer was a way of connecting back to the historical practice of the Hebrew temple. The early Christians obviously had a very different interpretation of what it meant to continue in the ancient Hebrew tradition. They saw the destruction of the temple as a fulfillment of the prophetic tradition, and so instead of seeking to continue the practice of temple worship, they symbolically reinterpreted it in light of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And so one of the things they started doing very early on was reinterpreting the Psalms, which were the temple songs, as prayers of the heart. And so one of the most quoted Psalms in the early church was Psalm 119, verse 164, 7 times a day I will praise you. So Clement of Alexandria, who I referenced earlier, actually quotes this psalm in the same essay as a way of emphasizing this larger point about the need to expand our sense of prayer out into everyday life. So even in its original context, the number 7 here is not meant to be taken literally. Temple practice, again, was to pray 3 times a day. In Hebrew, the number 7 is sacred. Why? What? Right. He's paying attention. It has to do with our theology of creation. It goes back to God rested on the 7th day. He made it holy by setting it apart for rest. So in Hebrew, the number 7 is kind of a code word for completion, eternity, wholeness. And so what the psalmist is saying here is something more like, I will praise you always. I will praise you unceasingly. This is what Paul actually references when he says in his first letter to the Thessalonians, here it is, to rejoice always and pray without ceasing. And this question of what it might look like to pray without ceasing was a real preoccupation of the early Christian writers, right? Because they recognized it doesn't mean to like go around reciting words all day, right? It means something more than that. So what does that look like? And one of the earliest practices that we know developed was a practice of literally stopping 7 times a day to pray. We know this from a document that dates back to at least the 4th century, but possibly even as early as the 2nd century, that describes in detail the regular prayer practices of everyday Christians. And it says that they prayed on rising, at the lighting of the evening lamp, so that was around sunset, at bedtime, at midnight, and also at the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours of the day being the hours associated with Christ's passion. That seems like a lot, right? Does that seem like a lot? How do they do this without it becoming another cosmic vending machine practice, right? In order to understand that, it helps to know a little something about how ancient people experienced daily time. And so last week we talked about how the ancient Greeks had 2 words for thinking about time, right? Chronos, which is chronological time, and kairos, which is a moment or a specific time for something. There's another, probably more well-known way of delineating between 2 different experiences of time that's relevant to this conversation. Circles and arrows. Sometimes you'll hear this being referenced as a way of saying that the circular, cyclical way of understanding time is more of an Eastern thing, and that the arrow, more sort of linear, progressive way of thinking about time is more of a Western thing. I hope that by the end of today, you will understand that that's not really the case at all. That in the Western world, people very much lived within a cyclical experience of time throughout antiquity and the Middle Ages, and really up until quite recently. It arises out of modern capitalism and industrialization, which, to be fair, does take root in Western Europe and England first, but certainly nowadays it has spread to all parts of the globe. And we see in, certainly in Asia, but also in the global south and in Africa, this shift, this transition happening from a more cyclical way of experiencing time to a more linear, progressive way of experiencing time. So this is sort of everywhere now. But in the ancient world, even in Western Europe, this cyclical way of experiencing time was just kind of how, that was the commons. That was how everyone experienced time. Yeah.
And you can tell me if this story is apocryphal, but I heard that it was around the time of St. Francis that the technology evolved to begin to put clocks in steeples in town centers, and he started protesting because he knew that people would begin, instead of the seasons, they would begin to measure worth and value based on the hour.
That's really interesting.
And it reshaped, and so he was protesting that.
That feels like an apocryphal story.
It's probably apocryphal.
Because we attach a lot of these kinds of things to St. Francis, and especially in this country, right? It's like always St. Francis was like the wise man back there who knew that this was all coming. But I'm going to get to clock towers actually in this. So, but yeah, people didn't have watches, they didn't have clocks, so they didn't experience time in a standardized or in a mechanical way. And more importantly, they didn't experience time in a way that was divorced from the natural world around them, right? They experienced time as being inherently connected to a sense of place. So time and the passage of time was intrinsically linked to the movements of the sun, the moon, the planets, the stars, in relation to the ground you stood upon. So it was a very embodied way of being in the world. And the solar and lunar cycles especially were important because they determined the amount of light that you would have to work with from one day to the next. So remember that for ancient people, light meant safety. So it mattered that you had more sun to work with in the summertime. It mattered that you had light at night during a full moon so you could like hunt at night. It meant safety. So people paid attention to this stuff, right? It was extremely important to be attentive to your geographical location in relation to all these celestial movements. And I say this because nowadays in our like postmodern context, it sounds very new agey, or like only pagan people like pay attention to stuff like that. But it's really important to understand that orienting yourself according to the patterns of the natural world was something everybody did. Jews, Jesus, Christians, everybody. Because the natural world around you was creation. It was God's. So it was not just wise to pay attention to the natural world, but it was reverent. It was respectful to the creator of this good universe. The reason that so many different cultures all over the world ended up with a calendar system of around 360 days that are split evenly into 12 months of approximately 30 days each, that's not an accident, that's not just arbitrary, but it has to do with the fact that every 29 and a half days there's a full moon. And so there's 12 full moons in every one solar cycle, right? That's just the way it is. So from there, it only seemed natural for people to shrink this yearly cycle of 12 moons down into 12 divisions for the day and 12 divisions for the night, which created 24 divisions in a full daily cycle. And since people experience that from the ground, right, we can depict it like that. Incidentally, this is what the earliest sundials looked like. It's the earliest sundial that we have found, around 1500 BC in Egypt. And there's a little hole here, you stick a stick in it, and then you can follow the shadows of the sun as it moves across the sky in 12 even divisions. Right? Does that make sense? So the word hour comes from an older word that literally means shine. So it's literally just a division of sunshine. That's what an hour is. And you have the first hour, second hour, third hour. What do you notice about these hours? Yeah, they're all equal, right? If you buy a sundial today, they're like squashed. So it tries to like equate it to our modern experience of standardized time. But the trouble with trying to translate the ancient idea of solar time into our modern experience of time is that the length of each hour is going to differ every single day, depending on two things, your latitude and the season of the year, right? So in the summertime, an hour could be up to 75 minutes. And so also your nighttime hours are going to be short. They're going to be 45 minutes, right? They just shrink down because they're just even divisions of time. There's actually 2 times a year that the hours during the day would be the same length as the hours during the night. What would that be? The equinox. Equinox literally means equal night, right? So those times of the year, you had equal hours during the day and the night. But at all other times, they just varied depending on your location and what time of year you were in. So this was the common way of understanding time in the ancient world. And it's a lot to keep track of for an individual person. That's a lot of little divisions. And so it became common in the Roman Empire, certainly around the time of Jesus, to divide these 24 divisions into 8 sections of 3 hours each. So then you had 4 sections of the day, and you had 4 sections or watches of the night. And they had different ways of keeping track of time and the passage of time at night. Obviously, you don't have shadows where you can keep track of it, but they had like water clocks that would drip, or sand, or candles that would burn. But there were watches because it was literally somebody's job to watch it during the night, and you had to, trade that off. And so in the cities, it came to be that somebody's job was to ring the bell at each of these times to mark the passage of time for everybody within earshot. The word clock actually originally comes from a French word that means bell. So plus this sense of linear progressive time, and the original sense of a clock is this more communal sense of the daily cycle of a village with bells ringing at the transition points of each part of the day. We actually see this in the Bible. So in Matthew's story of Jesus walking on water, it says, in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. The fourth watch is this last part of the night, and it includes the twilight just before dawn. And it was customary for people to be up, especially fishermen, to be up and awake during that time, because people woke up to begin their day at a time known as, where is it? Come on, there it is. Oh, this thing is wonky. There it is, cock crow. We hear about cock crow also in the Bible, right? That's what Jesus says to Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times before cock crow. That's not just like a random bird that shows up for narrative effect. It's an actual time of day in the ancient world. It was basically when the alarm clock went off. Because remember, people were just living their lives in relation to the natural world, in relation to the birds and the animals that also got up at this time of day. And so this is when people woke up. It's just quite naturally the earthly sound of the alarm clock going off. So if we look at then this early text that we have that describes the early Christian practice of praying the hours, we see that it's actually referencing these very natural transition points in the daily cycle of what was commonly experienced as people's everyday lives. So on rising, which would be a cock crow, at the lighting of the evening lamp, which was something they did in the cities around sunset, at bedtime, at midnight, and at the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours. Ah! What's happening? Oh dear. Greg.
I need a new clicker.
Huh? We've gone way ahead. Hold on. That's spoilers. Okay. So it also says that the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours are, we stop there because they're associated with Christ's passion, right? So the Gospels actually went out of their way to situate the story of Christ's passion in time, so that as we walk through each day of our lives, we can walk alongside Jesus. So the 3rd hour is the time for Jesus' sentencing. The 6th hour is associated with the time of his crucifixion, and the 9th hour is associated with the time of Jesus' death. So this gets tied to certain times of the day in the daily cycle. Another thing you have to keep in mind when thinking about this kind of symbolic understanding of the daily cycle is that in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the new day was actually understood to begin at sunset. So not at midnight, which is what the Romans kind of did in their like civic lives, and not at sunrise, which was actually what a lot of pagans kind of thought. But in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the new day begins at sunset. Why? Why would that be?
Because when God created the earth, there was no light.
What?
Because when God created the earth, there was no light.
Bingo. This guy's paying attention. Right, we're back on theme with creation, right? So, yes, creation, 6 days, and then there's rest. But on the first day, we begin in darkness, and then there's light. So this is why we see this same pattern in our daily cycle, in our weekly cycle, and in our yearly cycle of the liturgy. So this is why the church year begins not with the birth of Jesus, which might seem logical, but with this season of Advent, this season of waiting and watching in darkness. It's also why Masses in the Roman Catholic tradition will often still begin on sunset on Saturday night, the day before, right? Because technically, and we still do this on Christmas Eve and the Great Vigil of Easter, even in our tradition, we recognize that the day actually begins the night before. But it's also reflected in our daily prayer cycle where Vespers, which is the prayer service that's traditionally held at sunset or around sunset, is considered the most liturgically significant because it's ending one daily cycle and beginning another. And if you ever get a chance to, has anybody ever been to a Vespers service at a monastery? If you ever get a chance to do that, I highly recommend it. It's often one of the services that is open to the public, particularly if you go to an Orthodox monastery. Highly recommend it. It can begin as early as 4 o'clock or even as late as 7. So it's not tied to a specific time, but more a time of day. So the word Vespers actually comes from the word Venus, the planet, because it's one of the first things that you see. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but about 30 minutes after twilight or after sunset, you see Venus there hovering in the air. So that became known as the Vesper Light. We actually hear this referenced in our own BCP evening prayer. So the Phos Hilaron, which is an ancient prayer for this moment of Vespers, it references, "O gracious light, pure brightness of the ever-living Father in heaven, O Jesus Christ, holy and blessed, now as we come to the setting of the sun, and our eyes behold the Vesper light, we sing thy praises, O God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit." So there's more to it, but the Vesper light is referencing Venus, the planet, because it's what appears during this transition of twilight from one day into the next. So this is where I want the handout. I made this handout so that it will help you hopefully to think about how these ancient prayer times within solar time, within natural time, might translate into something like basically our modern day clock time. It can be confusing because when you see the word terce and you think that means third, so you think third hour, you might think that's like 3 o'clock, but it literally just means the third 12th of sunlight after the sunrise, right? So that's a quite different thing. On your handout, you'll see it says that's around 9 a.m. If you go to terce, but it's not actually 9 a.m. There's no 9 a.m. in solar time. It's the third 12th of sunlight after the sunrise, right? So that actually starts at a different time each day, depending on your latitude, your distance from the equator, and what season you're in. So I actually looked this up. Today in Durham, for example, a solar hour is going to be about 49 minutes long, and terce, the third hour, actually began just a little while ago at 8:50 this morning. So we are currently in the third hour of solar time. So I'm just going to go down the list as you have it there. There's matins, which, let me get it up here on the screen. Matins, which means of or belonging to the morning. That would have been prayed at cockcrow, or when getting up for the day. You had lauds, which was for the moment of sunrise, which was a practice very early on. By as early as the 2nd century, Christians were gathering at the start of their workday to pray, especially on Sundays, because Sunday was a work day originally. So they'd gather at sunrise at the first day of the week, because that represented Christ's resurrection. Terce, as we already said, was the third hour, so that marks the movement from into the second part of the day, and was associated with the time of Jesus' sentencing. But even for us, in our normal, boring work weeks, it's often the time that we are faced with the work that is before us. So that's how we're meant to connect with Jesus' story of his last day. Then there's sext, which is the 6th hour of sunlight, so that's usually around noon. It's the hour associated with the time of Jesus' crucifixion, so it's often why churches will have a Good Friday service at noon. The monks had a word for this time of day called acedia. There's a really great book by Kathleen Norris about it, for this kind of apathetic despair that can set in sometimes midway through the day, where you're like, it's a slog of labor. And that's something that we're especially called to watch for at that time of day, at that noonday moment. Nuns refers to the 9th hour of sunlight. So in the ancient world, that typically marked the end of the workday. So when people would go home and get washed up for supper. It's also the time associated with Jesus' death. So it's the time when we and the day and Jesus say, it is finished, right? Then Vespers happens at sunset, begins the new cycle. And then from there, you have the evening watches, starting with Compline at this transition between the first and the second watch, which is usually around 9 p.m. And in later monastic tradition, it became customary to not speak from the end of Compline to the beginning of Matins the next day. This is called the Great Silence, and it's still observed in many Benedictine monasteries today. It just calls us into a time of quiet during the night. But you also had vigils, which is actually in the middle of the night. So this might sound crazy, but in the ancient world, this idea of like 8 hours of sleep, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of leisure is actually a modern construct. It's pretty recent. It's why a lot of people's natural body rhythms don't align with that exactly. So anybody who's ever struggled with like waking up in the middle of the night, you're actually doing something that humans did for a really long time, and still do in many Muslim countries actually. But throughout the Middle Ages, people would get up in the middle of the night to study or pray, and so that was known as vigils. So this practice of like punctuating each turning point in the day with prayer is what was passed down. We talked last week about how the desert monks were like athletes for Christ, right? They showed people what this would look like if it was like fully lived, but then there were like varying degrees of how much any given person might, step into this and on any given day. But the idea was there, and it was passed down until the 6th century, when a monk who was living in a broken down part of the Western Empire in Italy decides to start a monastery. And he decides to take this tradition, this like ancient tradition of daily prayer, and translate it into kind of a codified, standardized version that anybody could follow. And of course, his name was Benedict. And he created the Rule of Saint Benedict. It has instructions. Has anybody ever read the Rule of Saint Benedict? Yeah, I highly recommend it. It's pretty short. It's kind of entertaining. It's got instructions for lots of different kinds of things, like when to work, how many rations of beer should you get a day, how to get along with others. There's some good stuff in there, but mostly what it's doing is standardizing this practice of praying the daily hours, and the purpose was to pray them together as a whole community. Right? So instead of me as a like individual athlete for Christ, living as a hermit and trying to follow my own rhythm of prayer, the monks started praying alongside each other as kind of one organism, right? They were able to support each other in this practice of praying the daily hours and punctuating each transition point in the day with remembering our connection to the journey of Christ and remembering that Christ walks with us in our daily lives. This practice spread like wildfire across Europe. It became basically the basis for all of Western monasticism. But it wasn't just monks that followed these daily cycles, because they were really central to the villages of Western Europe all throughout the Middle Ages. And so the first clockmakers were actually Christian monks. They were trying to figure out a way to make the bells toll at these transition points, just like the ancient practice, throughout the day, so that the entire village could hear that and could remember that this was a time for pausing, right? It was even if you just paused in the middle of the day in your field because you heard the monastery bells, it was a reminder that this is a time for us to pause. And so there was a relationship between people in the village living secular lives and the people in the monasteries who kind of marked these times for prayer. And it was also monasteries that first put clocks in the clock towers, again, to connect people to this practice of the daily cycle of prayer. This continued all the way up until like the 19th century. So the idea of divorcing a sense of time from a sense of place is a really recent phenomenon. It was only even invented, like the first person to come up with the idea of it was 1878. And it was instigated by the invention of the railroad and the telegraph, right? So, and photography, yeah. Right, so that wasn't that long ago, right? It's not that long ago that we actually lost a sense of this. And so the idea, again, is, I said this last week, you can't put Chronos back in the box, right? You can't, there's no Control Z in real life, so we can't go back in time. This is gone. We live in arrow time now, right? That's where we live. So I want to offer a few suggestions, sort of practical suggestions for how I think we might be able to cultivate a sense of this. But there's a couple of key takeaways here, and they are that truly this was a communal practice, right? That it was tied to the natural cycles of time and God's creation, and that it was less about getting something done, right, on our religious to-do list, less of that button-pushing sense, and more about a way of remembering periodically throughout each transition, the natural transitions of our day, to stop and rest. So the first resource for this, obviously, is this thing right here. The Book of Common Prayer. The Book of Common Prayer was created precisely to make the practice of prayer common. That was the whole point of this thing. It took what in Western Europe over time became this strictly monastic practice that was really divorced from everyday life, and it tried to translate it back into a format that everybody could participate again. That was the whole point of this. And that's why in the Book of Common Prayer, it doesn't begin with our weekly liturgy, right? That's like page 365, which is probably what most people use it for now, right? But that's not where it starts. It starts with morning prayer, right one, right? Because the idea is that everybody would be doing this. It has morning prayer. Where is it? Oh. There we go. So yeah, it's got morning prayer, noonday prayer, evening prayer, which is Vespers, and Compline. So it's translating this older thing into not just the vernacular language, right? That's a huge part of what this was doing, was translating into the kind of language that people actually spoke, but it's also translating it into an experience of time that was more natural to what people were living now. So it simplifies this a little bit. First of all, we get rid of vigils, right? That's gone. We don't do that anymore. The practices of matins and lauds basically get combined into morning prayer. These little hours, they're sometimes called terce, sext, and nuns, get combined into, noonday prayer, you said it. Vespers obviously becomes evening prayer, and Compline stays Compline. And so we still have, within this tradition, this sense of marking these natural transitions in our day with prayer, with resting in God. That's what this is meant to be. Has anybody ever used the daily office in that way? As a way of, what's your experience of that been? To use this daily office as a way of punctuating life with prayer? Is it complicated? Has anybody ever tried and failed?
There's a lot of page flipping.
There's a lot. So the tricky thing about this is that it's updated now, more so, but it comes from a time when people were more functioning in community. It's something we've really lost, is that sense of the commons. So we have much more individualized lives now. But so the prayers in here were really meant to be prayed in a communal context, where you still have that call and response sense of being together in prayer. It doesn't always translate super well into an individualized kind of prayer. And then there's also like 100 different choices for collects, or there's all these canticles, and there's all these, flipping around. So sometimes you have to have like a PhD to navigate it. So one of the things that they added in the 1979 book was starts on page 136, and it's called Daily Devotions for Individuals and Families. And if you never found that before, look that up, because it's a very streamlined version of prayer that you can do as an individual for each of these times of prayer. If you don't know what to do during, like you want to pray the hours, but you don't know what to say, that's what this is for. There's another resource that is, I think, much more for people that want to explore, like, what is my actual rhythm of daily life? What are the natural transition points in my life, and how might I, as an individual, kind of punctuate that with times of contemplative rest? And it's by a Benedictine sister named Macrina Whitaker. I'm probably butchering her last name, but it's called 7 Sacred Pauses. And she goes through each of the times of prayer, the traditional and communal practice, and kind of looks at, like, what did they mean? What were they doing? And then how do I think about in my life now, what would capture a sense of resting for me now in my own life? So I used this when I was on sabbatical to create for myself a little booklet of my own kind of daily hours, which I use just for my own devotions. And it just sits on my coffee table. I meant to bring it, but it just sits on my coffee table. It's very simple. It's mostly just a psalm and a couple of prayers. But it's a way of, if I'm remembering to pray and I need the words, it's there. What I don't do is set an alarm on my phone for certain times of day, right? And say, I'm gonna pray at 3 o'clock. We're gonna stop everything, and because that's kind of not the point. I also don't look up on my computer when the astronomical sunrise was and then calculate the divisions of solar time to figure out where the third hour would be wherever I am, right? Because that's kind of not the point, right? The point is to remember that we're walking with Jesus. So that's why these prayer times traditionally were connected to the walk of Jesus' last day. That we are walking with Jesus. We're not alone in this. And that we stop at periodic times to have mini sabbaticals, mini Sabbaths, to rest in that. To remember that we're not God and that's okay. So that's the invitation for daily prayer. And there's lots of ways to do it. You can also just pause. You don't have to say anything at all. You can literally just rest for 5 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever you can do. But the point is, you don't have to say, okay, I'm gonna rest for 5 minutes 7 times a day at these particular times, right? One of the things that I've tried to do is to pay closer attention to the light every day. So when I notice that we've moved into kind of the golden hour, right, that afternoon light where things are ending, I remember to pause, and I remember that Christ is with me in all my endings. Or when I'm squinting for the morning sunlight, I remember that Christ is with me in all the beginnings, right? That's really the inner spirit of this practice of daily prayer. So, well, I'll just stop there and I went right up to time. But if you, does anybody have any questions or things they want to share about their own experience of praying the hours or trying to? Okay, well, I think we're done here.
Thank you, Kristen. So next week, on Saturday, we're having our iconography workshop with Merrick, which I think that's sold out in 2 days. But on Sunday, during Adult Forum, he's going to be our speaker, and he's going to talk about writing icons and their history and the meaning of what it means. And so if you're unfamiliar with iconography, it's a whole nother beautiful path of spiritual practice and waking us up and opening our hearts. And if you are already familiar with it, you're probably definitely coming. It's just this incredible spiritual tradition. And then on the fourth Sunday of Advent, Kristen is going to come back and wrap up this series on sacred time. So thank you so much, Kristen.
Yeah.
We'll see you next week.